A Keystone Extracurricular is how you give your application some pop and impress admission committees. So what is a Keystone Extracurricular? In essence, it is literally anything you genuinely care about, and as a result of that, you're able to endlessly have drive and work towards it. And the result you get from that establishes two primary things for an admission committee, otherwise known as an AdCom. The first thing is, it allows them to understand who you are. And this is important because while you get to do this in your essays, you have to have something to talk about and point back to in the first place. You can't just waffle on without anything to kind of show for it. And the second thing it does, assuming you actually spend the hours working towards it, is it establishes work ethic outside of school stuff. Because admission committees no longer view the game of getting into medicine as a stats-based mechanism. It is now more of a holistic process that looks at working towards a goal outside the field of academics as well as within the field of academics. In essence, this is a very simple concept. You just pick something that you care about, and then you do cool stuff with it until you think it's impressive enough to put on your primary application. I'm going to go over two examples which have been proven effective both by me and a friend to get into very competitive medical schools. So I'll talk about what I did first. I started a study course and I gave it away for free to students around the world. And that may sound underwhelming, but obviously I dolled it up a little bit and I put in more work than you may otherwise expect. So what did I do? I spent months taking random courses on studying. I read papers, I tested methods myself, I reflected, I iterated. All the normal stuff one might expect when they're learning a new skill. When I finished, I transformed all that information into a several-part course, and I put that online and started giving it away to whoever wanted it. And I gained a decent amount of traction. About 80 or so students eventually ended up joining from across the globe. And I kind of took advantage of that skill and I called it a Global Study Skills Initiative on my application. And please understand what I was doing here. I fluffed my idea. Yes, obviously I did. You should be fluffing everything as well, because if you don't, you're just underselling. You're not even lying. You're doing yourself a disservice. And we can argue if my product really deserved the title of a global initiative. You could say, yeah, I had students around the globe, so it did. You could also say I had one guy in like India and like 3 others in various other random countries. And that's not nearly enough for an initiative. Either way, the point was I was able to speak about it and I was able to have my story stand up to a lot of scrutiny from admission committees. And the reason for that was I put a sufficient amount of work initially so that not only would my story hold up, but I would be drawing on reality rather than BS when I started speaking and writing about my accomplishment. I want to drive this point home, which is don't just assume you can make something up and lie about it. A lot of people attempt that. The problem is, unless you really train the skill of speaking, there's a different power and energy to your words when you draw from experience and difficulty, as opposed to just random ideas and thoughts that you think sound cool. And the second part of the equation here is tying your activity back to the field of medicine. In my field, that was really easy because, as you may know, teaching is really important for a career in medicine. Not only do you have to teach your own patients about their problems and their complications, but you also are going to eventually have to teach your med students when you're a resident, and then your lower year residents when you're a higher tier resident, and then all the residents when you're an attending, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about how I made that tie really explicit. I identified skills that I got out of running this course. And I spoke about those in detail depending on the essay prompt or the interview question I was asked. So what did I learn? Well, I did learn some teaching. And I also learned to be compassionate. And then finally, I learned some degree of leadership as I brought other students to be instructors and reviewers for people in the course. And these are all crucially important to understand. These are buzzwords. Medical schools always have some essay or the other, or some question asking about these values. That doesn't mean I use one activity for every essay. It means depending on the application and depending on the secondaries each school gave me, which are kind of like supplemental essays, I would identify which supplemental I had the weakest external experience for, and then I would use my Keystone Extracurricular to boost that one thing. And in other words, I had other leadership experience. I was a research mentor. I had other experiences in which I taught. Again, research mentor, as a volunteer coordinator, all these sort of things. But depending on the school's background and depending on their specific prompt, perhaps my experience as a research mentor is less relevant than my experience teaching students various study skills. So I had a friend who ended up getting into one of the most competitive medical schools in the country. Despite this, his application wasn't bursting with stats and all sorts of academic accomplishments. So that kind of begs the question as to what were the other factors that helped him get an edge over other applicants. And I believe his Keystone activity was one of those. So what he ended up doing was earning his private pilot's license. He was really passionate about aviation and flying throughout college. And so he put in hundreds of hours outside of his classes, getting training and getting a license to fly a private plane. And now, I'm sure you can appreciate why this is an interesting, cool activity to do. And I'm sure you can appreciate how difficult it may be. But what may not be clear is the link this has to medicine, because as I mentioned before, that is also important. You can't just write about some random nonsense that has nothing to do with medicine. And well, what he ended up doing was he talked about his desire to do space medicine. When he first told me about this, I felt like this was a stretch. And you may feel that way as well. But the results kind of speak for themselves. At the end of the day, he elucidated a solid link between this activity, which seems completely unrelated to medicine, and his desire for a future practice. Now, whether or not he actually goes into space medicine is completely irrelevant, because he already got into the medical school. And however, he formed this reason, and at the time, he genuinely was emotionally invested in space medicine. As a result, he was able to speak articulately, clearly, and with passion about his activity and his future career. So you should be listening to this thinking, okay, you can connect practically anything to space medicine and still get into medical school. And I really want to hammer this point down specifically, because most people I've spoken to had this idea that they had to pick something explicitly tied to medicine, such as clinical volunteering or research or patient care. And while those are important, they are important for specific and separate parts of the application. For your Keystone activity, which I would argue makes up the core component of your application along with your grades and your MCAT, you really should pick something that you have a genuine passion for, even if it seems like it has zero tie to medicine whatsoever. And again, the reason for that is because doing so will provide you with care, and that care will give you some drive, and that drive will allow you to sink hours even after you've become demotivated due to your tests, exams, or whatever other extracurriculars you're doing. The final thing I want to hammer down is I want to give you an understanding of how many hours it actually takes to make something cool. And imagine getting a private pilot license. That's hundreds of hours of practice, not including, the time to get there, the scheduling, the effort, the financial cost. And the same can be said for my study skills initiative that I started. Despite not seeming as intensive, it was still a very significant time draw for my first few years of college. And so what I want to say with this is you should evaluate the ideas that are popping up in your head against these two examples. And you need to understand that if you can achieve what you want to do in a week or in a month, that's not the limit of your potential. Set a goal that's higher than that and work towards it over the next couple years to make your application really stand out. And there's a document in the description with a brief description of study skills and discipline mindset stuff. If you struggle with that, you can check it out. Go do your work.